Issue number 6 of the OWASP API security issues, we look at mass assignment. And what this effectively is you're effectively just sending all of your variables at once without checking them and allowing everybody to, they can send any of the variables that they want, or even additional variables if they want, variables that you hadn't planned for. And this can allow for unknown assignment, unpredictable behavior, so on and so forth. They supply examples of what people are doing down here. They're just taking all of the variables, all of the parameters, and just assigning them directly into the object, directly into the database. And you shouldn't be doing that. People should have like some defaults, or users should, you should be checking based upon the rule what people should be sending. For instance, an administrator should be allowed to send and set every variable, whereas a user can only set specific variables. For example, let me show you a schema that we have in the BAPI framework. For example, on update, everybody can set username and password and email on their specific account, but the role admin can change the ID, they can change enabled, and additional variables. I can also put in here account expired and other variables into role admin. So role admin can change all of these additional variables. You wouldn't want the user to be able to change their ID on this, because they could effectively overwrite somebody else's ID. The database should catch that, but so on and so forth. Or they could send ID and effectively overwrite somebody else's information, and that would be very bad. So this is why this is a security vulnerability. Issue number 7 is sort of a catch-all for bad security configurations. Basically, no cores, bad handling of HTTP headers, etc., etc. And I hate how they just throw this all into one category, saying, yeah, you should lock down your directories, you should handle things with cores, or you should handle your UI front ends with cores, and you should be handling your HTTP headers and checking your HTTP headers, putting your classic example, I had to actually, on an old project that I worked with, I saw somebody, and I'm not going to tell you the project because it's a very widely used project, but I actually saw them sending the token in the URL line in the browser. And I was like, no, you don't send the token in the URL. This can be cached in the search engines and things like that. You send it in the headers, in the bearer token. And apparently they were doing both. But yeah, that's a severe security misconfiguration. And yeah, it's just, you don't do that. You watch your verbose errors, because verbose errors can be caught, and they can also verbose errors can also be caught by search engines as well. And you don't want a lot of this stuff to be picked up by search engines, because that information can lead to holes in your security. People can read that information, and if there's too much information there, people can go, oh, okay, I can use that, and get in and create a backdoor into your application, into your APIs. So yeah, it gives some information here, but it's just sort of a catch-all category saying, hey, secure your application and use good security methodologies. Not very informative, and I really don't think this is much of a security. It's an issue, but it really doesn't belong here for the most part. Just saying, hey, you should have good security. That's like saying, hey, you should have a heartbeat. So I don't really know what to say about this one. But yes, have good security. That's a good thing. Okay, so many people, this has been going on for such a long time that people should learn by now that SQL injection is an issue, and injection of code is an issue. And just to validate your properties and variables before using them. And yet, for some reason, people still don't do this, and this is still a problem. I guess new programmers and millennials still don't get this yet. But yeah, it still goes on. Sorry, millennials, for those of you who are listening, for the good ones out there, for the good programmers out there, there are bad programmers out there, people who use PHP and stuff that are ruining it for the rest of you. But yeah, there are programming languages that just have this built in, and I say this as a Java programmer that it's just built in. I mean, there is validation that is just built in, and even when it is not, there are ways to add this in. For instance, we add this in for our tests so that you can say, type long, type string, and it will validate this. And even when it's a string, you can still validate the input. And you can say, it shouldn't have these special characters and so on and so forth. And these special characters are should not be being used. And it will check for those special characters, and so that you can't use those. All of those special characters will get flagged. All of those special characters will should get removed, or should flag something to say, hey, whoa, you can't use that. That's not acceptable. Especially with Hibernate. Hibernate will throw a horrible error if you attempt to do something like that, which is a nice thing about Hibernate. A lot of people who don't use ORM or ORM or things like that will be having to do that by hand. So yeah, that's up to you. That's up to you as a user to be validating that kind of information. Otherwise, I would suggest to use some kind of ORM to cache the object, to check those before it goes on in. It will save you a lot of time. Yeah, it's not SQL, but it provides a lot of additional benefits of caching that object, and it can improve your speed in other ways where it lacks in speed in some ways. So it is a good trade-off in a lot of ways, and it can help you. So definitely look into that, I would suggest. So this is actually an interesting point. Number 9 is talking about how attackers will use improperly protected like test, staging, and development versions to attack production. And they will use like test APIs and production or staging APIs to get passwords that may be used in production, or tokens that may be being used in production, or any kind of backdoor or entry point that they can use to get into production or to the production database. Some people will actually be using a production database, or they'll be using tokens or things that are still in the production database that got moved over. And that's what they're talking about about improper asset management. And those will enable them to get into production. And first off, your staging, testing, and production should all be properly secured locally. I do those on localhost development and everything on localhost. So, I mean, it's kind of hard for you to get into my localhost unless you can get into my local machine and everything. And you would have to get into the local network, and then you'd have to get into my local machine. And sure, absolutely, that would be improper security on the network. And I have no control over that. Then I would have to have moved my personal database on my personal machine into production, or some of that data into production, and that would be bad. You don't move any of that data from my development into production because it's completely unrelated. Same thing with testing, same thing with staging. All of that data and all of those databases should all be completely separate. They should all have completely separate properties files, completely separate databases. The BAPI framework is actually built to maintain separate databases and separate properties files and everything. And your API frameworks and setups should also be maintained the exact same way. A professional development environment should be set up to maintain separate properties files, separate databases, separate environments, so on and so forth. And that's what this is talking about. All of your environments should be completely separate so that none of that data gets into your production environment, allowing for people to create an entry point into production. If they get access to testing or staging or anything like that, then great. They've got access to your local testing or staging. Okay, no big deal. But they'll never get access to production. So separate out your environments, and there's never ever a problem. But if you don't separate those out, and you're putting those directly into production, then you've got a serious problem in more ways than one. Okay, so this last one, number 10, I cannot really argue, or I cannot really say that this is a security issue. This is just something that, you should be doing. This is something that you should be doing on all systems. You should be monitoring and doing logging. And so there's sufficient logging of the system to log to see who's coming in, who's checking out the system, logging errors that are thrown, and so on and so forth, and logging to see if there's any kind of DDoS going on, stuff like that. And there is excessive logging where it will slow down your system, slow down the amount of processing that you can do. And often the two get confused. And I would say do a minimum amount of logging to be able to monitor. And that is what you should be doing. And it's not so much a security issue. It is just what every single network system administrator should be doing. To say that this is, it's to make sure that attacks do not go unnoticed, or attack vectors do not go unnoticed. And that's what this is. It's not insufficient security. It's just watching for attack vectors. And I really, it's a bit of a stretch to call it lack of security, because what you're doing is you're monitoring for attack vectors, and it is not necessarily an attack. It is not necessarily bad security. It is merely watching for attack vectors. So it's good to do. It's not necessarily bad security. And this is a bit of a stretch. But you should do it. Don't do excessive logging. Move it to a separate system so that it doesn't affect your API processing and things like that. I would say move monitoring to a Node.js system so that you can just monitor, pull the data to Node.js and take a look at the logs, or take a look at the stats and see how it's doing and stuff like that. And that's about all you need to do. But yeah, it's just looking at your attack vectors, not necessarily attacks or a lack of security. And there you have it.